But aside from our honoree, Alice Rivlin has been the director of the Congressional Budget Office and the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and on the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, and a past winner of the Concord Coalition Economic Patriot Award. So what more could you want? Michael Peterson is director and chairman and CEO of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. He had a long, extensive experience as an entrepreneur and investor in the private sector. Before that, of course, the Peterson Foundation is very much involved in solving the challenges of the long-term fiscal and economic challenges of the nation. And Senator Jack Danforth, our co-chair, senator from Missouri from 1976 to 1995, and before that was Attorney General of the state of Missouri. So, as we, we've got some challenges here. When let me back up for a second here. Michael, I mentioned before that this is the first year that we've had this dinner without your father, Pete Peterson, who was so fundamental to the founding of the Concord Coalition. And if I could start with you and just ask if you could give us a few words about your father's legacy.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Bob. It was a great pleasure to see that video. I actually was there that day on the street with them and remember it clearly. My father had a great sense of humor, actually. He always loved to laugh and loved when people poked fun at him. And when Phil brought up running on empty, it reminded me of a great line that my dad loved about him. So he was good friends with Ted Sorensen, who was one of President Kennedy's speechwriters. And about his book, Running on Empty, Ted Sorensen said, with a title like Running on Empty, that must be an autobiography. And he also said, Running on Empty is a book that once you put it down, you won't be able to pick it up. So my dad loved those jokes, and it was great to see him. And I think if he were here tonight, I think he'd want to say two things probably. One is thank you. He was a very successful businessman and investor, obviously, but really what gave him pleasure and fulfillment in life was his public service. And so whether that was his work in government or his work in various organizations that he helped get started, like the Concord Coalition, I think he found that most fulfilling and rewarding. And so he's very grateful to you, Bob, and to all the partners here of Concord over the years for the fulfillment and experience that he had starting this organization and leading it with you for so many years. I think the second thing he would clearly say is keep going. This was his mission in life, was to address this long-term fiscal problem. He wrote 6 books on the subject and invested heavily through the foundation. Most of his legacy is on this issue, and so I think he'd want everyone here to keep it up and keep at it and focus continually on the problem until it's solved, and that's why I'm here running the foundation.
Well, we appreciate the great work of the Peterson Foundation, and your father did have a great sense of humor, and Michael, this is at the great memorial service in New York, when Michael spoke, he said that his father had left instructions that he was supposed to give a last chart talk with many charts showing, since he had a captive audience, the true dire fiscal problems of the nation. And Michael then said, "No, I'm just joking." And but I said to him afterwards, I was waiting. I was hoping that you were going to actually do it.
I think you were the only one.
I'm the only one that drinks Tab too. So anyway, today in Washington is also a National Day of Mourning for President George Herbert Walker Bush, and I thought we should take a minute and ask Alice and Jack if there were any remembrances of President Bush that they'd like to share. Alice.
I'd like to share a very relevant one, and I've been gratified in the torrent of talk about President Bush that quite a number of people have pointed to his courage in the 1990 budget deal, which was two kinds of courage. One was, to the great distress of many of his Republican colleagues, he went back on his read my lips pledge and actually agreed, in the context of this monumental agreement with the Democrats who controlled the Hill to raise taxes. He didn't get much credit for it. He got opprobrium from Republicans and very little credit from Democrats. But if you look back on the history, that deal was extremely important, along with another one in 1993, in getting us to the surpluses at the end of the 90s. But it wasn't just his courage in the tax increase. It was that deal laid out some rules, which in the Clinton administration we followed because it was the law, and that were very instrumental in getting to the surpluses at the end of the 90s. So I think we owe a lot to George H.W. Bush in the cause of fiscal responsibility.
Well, I vividly remember the day that 41 was inaugurated and being there on the steps of the Capitol during the inauguration and hearing him call out by name Democratic leaders in the House with whom he had served. And I thought that was very sort of characteristic of President Bush, because he did believe in personal relationships and he did believe in trying to work things out. And in essence, what he was saying to the Democratic leadership was, look, I'm a Republican, I'm going to be president, and you're in charge of Congress, and let's work together and do things together. And that's, I think, the opposite of the current situation. And then another thing that he did, about roughly a month after his inauguration, he invited all the members of the Senate to come to the White House, and not just to be in the first floor, the formal floors of the White House, but to go up to the living quarters on the second floor. And I can remember talking to Alan Cranston, who was the Democratic whip at the time. He said he'd never been up there, and he'd been decades in the U.S. Senate. And so that was the idea of embracing people and bringing them into the action. Sally and I, my wife Sally and I, of course, need I say this, plopped down on the bed in the Lincoln bedroom where our picture was taken, and we now have it framed on the wall by the president's brother, and our good friend in St. Louis, Bucky Bush, took this picture of these two rubes from St. Louis on the bed in the Lincoln bedroom. But I thought that was so characteristic of George Bush 41, actually of his son too, of creating personal relationships and trying to work things out, because if you work things out on a personal basis, you laid the foundation for getting serious things done.
Well, I hate to go from words of inspiration about Pete Peterson and George Herbert Walker Bush to the realities of the budget situation. I do really want to focus on positive things this evening, because we're often gloom and doom, and we often talk about, you know, the hard choices and that sort of thing. That sort of distinguishes the Concord Coalition. But I do think that we should be trying to paint a brighter future and how we get there. But before we get positive, let's just set the stage here to reiterate that there is a serious problem here. When Congress comes back, they're going to go to work on the fiscal year, not when they come back this year, but when the new Congress takes office. They're going to go to work on the fiscal year 2020 budget, and the projected deficit is $1 trillion. That's just astounding. I mean, that debt clock at New York City was $4 trillion. That was the whole debt at that time. we're talking about a $1 trillion deficit being projected for the next fiscal year in a strong economy, without a major war. Let me just pose the question, does that prove that deficits don't matter, or have people simply chosen to ignore them? Or both?
Well, I think it proves that people have chosen to ignore them, but you have to give them a little bit of credit. Many of us have been talking about this problem for several decades, and no disaster has ensued that can be obviously attributed to the size of the deficit. That doesn't mean it won't, but we have not gotten across what the problem is. And in part, I think, because we've said the sky is falling, and it hasn't actually fallen yet. Much of the world is very willing to lend to the United States of America at quite low interest rates. Because they think we're a very responsible country and we will pay our debts, and besides, we're the best game in town. And we have not explained how these several things fit together.
In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So here we have all these other countries supporting or partially supporting our deficit. And I think at some point it comes to an end. There's a tipping point at some point. We're not there yet. And we have been talking about this for decades. But when that point comes, I believe that point comes at some point. And when it does, it's not going to be pretty.
You know, one of the things that, speaking of things coming to an end, we're benefiting now from a strong economy, a very long recovery. It might not be always robust, but we're almost at a record recovery. It's been over 9 years. We're kind of due for a recession. So among the things that we should worry about, should policymakers now be thinking about a plan for what might happen when a recession hits, where you could deal with that and try to simultaneously deal with the long-term problem? Is that?
Well, I think we kind of have to change the narrative here. I appreciate what you're saying, which is the sky hasn't fallen yet. But I don't think we should have been arguing, and I don't think we should continue to argue that the sky will fall. I think our goal is not to borrow just enough so that, you know, $1 less than it would be in a crisis. I think the question is more, does this make sense? And when I look particularly at interest costs, so over the next few years, I think 3 years from now, we'll spend more on interest than we do on our kids. About 5 years from now, we'll spend more on interest than we do on national defense. About 10 years from now, it'll be the third largest program in the government. And so, okay, yes, we can borrow money right now. Yes, there's more room. We're not quite like Greece. Like, it doesn't mean the United States is going to crumble tomorrow, but does this make any sense to anybody? And I think, to what you said earlier about economic growth, I mean, the Republicans worked very hard to put in place $1.5 trillion tax cut to stimulate the economy. Democrats want to do $1 trillion infrastructure plan to stimulate the economy. The interest costs over the next 10 years are $7 trillion. So if we didn't have any debt, can you imagine what we could do with those funds that would actually be investments in our future as opposed to investments in our past? So rather than say the United States is going to crumble the next few years if we don't deal with this, I think we should talk about a rational economic policy for growth and inclusion and prosperity rather than the sky is falling.
One of the issues that would have to be dealt with in any sort of agenda that we've talked about a little bit is healthcare cost. I think universally the rising cost of healthcare is considered not just for federal programs but system-wide the biggest single programmatic challenge of the federal budget. So let's offer some ideas, some positive visions, if we could, for how we might get control of that, beyond just simply, well, we have to cut something or raise people's premiums. I mean, are there some strategies that are being worked on or that you think have promise? I mean, Jeff had mentioned his vision that would help to control healthcare costs and hence contribute to economic growth and improve the budget outlook.
I think that when you think about the entitlements, healthcare is easier to deal. Nothing's easy to deal with, but it's politically more possible to deal with healthcare than it is with Social Security, because essentially in Social Security you're saying, okay, we're going to limit the amount of dollars that the government is going to give you. That's tougher to argue than to say, okay, something is broken in the healthcare system and we've got to fix that systemically. And so I think that's very promising, and particularly to try to move away from the current system, which is fee-for-service medicine, where providers are paid by the test, by the procedure that they're doing, as opposed to what are the results in healthcare. So I think to move from fee-for-service to paying for performance is the way to go. I'll just give you sort of one personal example. So I went for a couple of years before I got wise to it to a dermatologist, and I began to think I am the annuity of my dermatologist, because the dermatologist, every time I would go in, would blast me about 10 times with liquid nitrogen and charge per blast. I didn't have to pay it. That was good. Medicare paid for it. But I thought, now I go to a dermatologist who doesn't do anything to me, and I like that. I think that that's a better deal. But I think that if we were to say to the healthcare providers, the doctors and the hospitals, we are going to pay you to keep people well, as opposed to just paying for the specific process that you're putting in place, that would be a very useful way to control the cost of healthcare.
The other thing is, I think we have the responsibility in the wrong place. The responsibility right now is on the government to pay for it, and we've lost the idea of the consumer. So I don't know any other market, I'm in business, I don't know any other market that works that way besides other things that the government is doing. But it seems to me that you have to have transparency to say how good is what is the quality, what is the cost of this, and put skin in the game for the consumer. And if you do that, allow them to control their destiny, to have the responsibility, and have part of the savings, you'll have entrepreneurs like me and a lot of other people in this room doing things that drive costs out of the healthcare system. It's not that hard to fix. We just got to, I think, turn it back the other way. Let the free market work.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think as Senator Danforth said, we have incentives that are totally upside down, right? The more they do to you, the more money they make, as opposed to the healthier you are. And as Jeff said, transparency and information is an essential ingredient in any market, right? Anyone who studies economics, information is critical in terms of quality and price. And so we have this private healthcare system that we call it, but it violates all the core rules of any economic equation. And so those two things are absolutely essential. But again, I think we also need to change the conversation a little bit. I mean, the entire national healthcare debate has been about the ACA, for example, for many years, and that was used as a political weapon, for several years. We find ourselves talking about pre-existing conditions ad nauseum. I mean, these aren't unimportant issues. They are important, but they are missing the overall problem, which is we spend 18, 19, heading to 20 to 25% of our GDP on healthcare costs, when many other nations have better outcomes and spend half as much. And that's a wage issue, so we're all concerned about slow wage growth. One of the reasons we have slow wage growth in this country is that the benefit package just keeps going up. I mean, as a businessman as I do, you do your annual budget and you see healthcare costs go up 11%, 12%, 9%, and that squeezes wages. It just does. So it's a wage issue. It's a competitiveness issue. Anybody creating jobs here has to deal with that as part of their cost structure. I think it's a huge education issue because it's crowding out spending at the state and local level because the healthcare obligations are rising so quickly. And a really scary statistic, we did a big project with the Institute of Medicine that outlined the level of waste in the system. The waste alone in healthcare is more than we spend on K through 12 education in this country. So if you care about education, you need to care about healthcare too. So
and by waste, you mean services that aren't needed,
unnecessary,
the sort of things that Jack Danforth was describing.
It's price, prices that are too high, unnecessary procedures,
And injurious.
Yeah, people getting infected at higher rates. I mean, when they infect you, they make more money. I mean, I'm not saying that they're doing it deliberately, but that's kind of upside down, right? I mean,
But sometimes maybe they do.
I hope not. But
I always wonder what my dentist is doing in there. Is he drilling holes, or I mean?
But I don't think we should leave the impression that this is somehow easy to fix. It's not, or it would have been fixed. And Senator Danforth says very rightly, we should pay for performance. But you can only pay for performance if you can measure performance. And we're not very good at that at the moment. And the hard work of designing a different set of incentives hasn't really been done yet. Now, Michael says the Peterson Foundation is working on this. Lots of people are working on this. But it's not a slam dunk. It's not easy.
Well, I mean, sometimes there are experiments that Medicare will run that work and that Congress rejects because they worked. Because somebody's constituent got.
I mean, what we describe as waste is somebody's income.
That's part of the conundrum of dealing with that.
Just one more point on healthcare. We were talking today about this, and you think about this. Here we are, a country probably the largest user of prescription drugs, yet we don't have a most favored nations clause where the government purchases the drug. Most favored nations clause means if anyone else buys that cheaper, you get that price. So we have Canada buying cheaper and all these other countries buying cheaper, yet we're the one buying the most drugs. Why aren't we getting the benefit of the deal?
Actually, the current Secretary of HHS has a proposal. It's a very limited proposal, and it only applies to Medicare Part B drugs. But it is sort of what you're talking about. It is that the pharmaceutical companies should price drugs to the U.S. at 126% or something of some average of what they're getting in the other.
See, there they go, complicating it again. Just say, all you got to say is, hey, look, X country bought it for this, so you got to match the price.
Yeah, they're but the essence of this proposal is exactly that.
Alice, you had the experience working both on the Rivlin Domenici task force, and I believe you tried to work with Paul Ryan on some way to make premium support work, the concept of premium support to have competition among providers for Medicare. And it always struck me that that was a really good idea, and it became highly politicized. Could you reflect a little bit on that?
Well, that's one of our problems, that we politicize everything. Yes, the idea of premium support is that for Medicare, the government would pay not on a fee-for-service basis, but would pay an HMO basically to provide Medicare services, and then the amount that the government would pay would be preset. And you could, if you were on Medicare, get your Medicare at that price, or if you wanted something fancier and better, you could pay more for it. And the guaranteed amount that the government would pay would not go up faster than some index. So that would make it predictable. And I think that makes quite a lot of sense, and it's been proposed again and again. It has to be proposed in a form that the current Medicare beneficiaries don't feel they're going to lose a lot. They're going, and that's perfectly possible.
And phasing in changes is one of the, I mean, that makes, a lot of this stuff can be phased in, and yet the political dialogue, as you just said, is kind of like looking at something that might happen 30 years and saying it's going to happen tomorrow.
Well, yes, and that's true of Social Security, too. Senator Danforth was talking about this, the terrible faces on the audience think they're going to get their Social Security benefits cut. Actually, no proposal to fix Social Security would hurt anybody who is currently on Social Security. And if one makes that clear, and makes clear that the changes are going to happen quite far in the future, there is much less kickback. We did that in 1983. We raised the retirement age, and it's still going on. It's being raised slowly over time, and nobody notices.
Yeah, but the problem is more than just the reality. The problem is the political statement that's going to be made in a 30-second commercial.
Oh, absolutely.
Senator Rivlin voted to cut your Social Security.
Yeah. And because I'm elderly, I get all these little announces, appeals. Send money so that those terrible people won't cut your Social Security.
And vote for me.
And vote for me,
Yeah.
yes.
It's interesting how many emails I get from politicians who have a moderate reputation of bipartisan working across the aisle. You get their fundraising emails like, Social Security is going to be killed next week if you don't send me $15. It's just like, oh my goodness. Okay, so moving on from healthcare, there's another subject that is kind of an interesting one that the Concord is exploring in these papers. You know, one of the reasons that economic growth is projected to be slower, much slower in recent years than the trend of the past 30 years or so, is that the labor force growth has slowed so dramatically with the aging of the population. And you look at some of the charts, and it's really dramatic that the potential workforce used to grow at somewhere around 1.5% a year, and now it's around 0.5% a year projected. That makes a big difference for the economic projections of the future, and that's that exacerbates some of these fiscal problems that we've been talking about. And nobody's saying you can really grow your way out without doing something on the fiscal side. But Jeff and I have been talking a lot, and we've got one of our papers is dealing specifically with immigration policy about can the United States help enhance growth by replacing, in effect, some of the population that we're losing? Is that a strategy for growth? How was that for a softball question, Jeff?
Absolutely. I think this is off. But, I think our death rate in this country is higher than our birth rate. And yet we have an aging population. And so when you think about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and all that, who's going to pay for it? So I think our concept is, we have to grow this population. And I think the best, easiest way to do that is through immigration. And not only just any immigration, but it's immigration on people that are going to make a difference to our country and growth. And if we do that and we bring a lot more of them in, we can change. Right now we're upside down. We have an aging population, and we have a youth, our children, that are going to have to pay for us. And there's not as many of them as there are as old people. So we're going to have to do something to change that. We can say, hey, pay to have more babies, but that's going to take a long time. So I think what we ought to do is immigrate a bunch of people that are the right people.
And another, does anybody have on immigration front?
On the economic side of it, I certainly agree. But we have to do that in a way that doesn't scare people. The people who come in look different from the average American, and we have a panic situation on our hands.
And to me, that's education. You know, it's how do we educate our citizenry on why this is so good. It's a lot like what you're saying about healthcare. We have to educate people. This is the problem, and here are the solutions. And there's just not that many. And so, yeah, they're going to look different than us. And is that bad? That's probably good. It makes us more interesting as a population.
I think it's, adding increased immigration to Social Security reform and Medicare reform is a very appropriate thing for the Concord Coalition to do. It really is the political agenda from hell, but it all is aimed towards economic growth. And so anyway, I kind of like this interest. Now, one of the things that I have to say, referring to Pete Peterson, is that he had a hard and fast rule that Concord Coalition dinners, or any dinner that he had anything to do with, was going to end at 9:30, no later than 9:30. He told this story that when he moved to New York, people asked him to go to dinners, and he would go, and people eventually asked him to chair a dinner, and he said, "I'll chair a dinner for your organization if you will promise me that it's over by 9:30. And they said, "Oh, no, Pete, you don't understand. Our people that come to our dinners like to hear speeches long into the night and have, and Pete said, no, I've been at these dinners as a guest, and I can tell you you're kidding yourself." So they said, okay, all right, well, because Pete was a very good dinner chairman, I can tell you that, because he used to chair our dinner. And he said that the first time he did that, he made an announcement at the beginning. He said, "I'm going to tell you something right now, and that is that this dinner will be over at 9:30, at which point Pete said he got the only standing ovation he'd ever had in his life. So we make that promise that we are over at 9:30, so we're going to have like one last question here with very brief answers so we can stick with the Peterson rule. I wasn't planning to quote Pete again, but we're looking at Pete Peterson's books. He wrote another one, which I love the title of, called, this was in 1994, somewhere around there, "Will America Grow Up Before It Grows Old?" 22 or so years later, do we know the answer to that question? Where are we on that?
We haven't grown up yet. I think we can say that. I don't know if we know the technical answer that will we eventually grow up. I think we will grow up before we grow old. I think there's a lot of problems around the world. The thing I like about this challenge is that it's fixable. We know exactly how to do it, and we're in total control of our budget. We don't need other countries to cooperate. We don't need to convince other people around the world, and I think we can do it. It's just a matter of the political will.
We just need to convince ourselves collectively.
Well, I don't know what the answer to that question is either, but I know that we're going to damn sure keep trying to grow up and encourage others. There's nothing we can do about growing old, let me put it that way. I can tell you that from personal experience, and but there's nothing we can do about that. But there's nothing inevitable about a crisis, and really, as I said at the beginning, it's very gratifying to see people who are still interested in this issue and who look at it as a future-oriented issue. That was what Pete Peterson, Paul Tsongas, and Warren Rudman always talked about. It's not the size of the budget deficit today or the debt today. It is a future-oriented thing. It's how are you going to have a sustainable fiscal future that's going to lead to the sort of economic growth that you need to preserve the American dream for future generations. That's what our volunteers are worried about. That's what our policy people are worried about. That's what I'm worried about. And that's what our panelists are worried about. So thank you all for coming. And by golly, I think we're going to do it this time. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.